December 25th, 1943. The Norwegian Sea. In the turbulent ink-black waters off the coast of occupied Norway, a ghost haunted the British Admiralty. This ghost was not a legend, but 42,000 tons of steel, armed with 9 11-inch guns and capable of 31 knots. It was the German battleship Scharnhorst. For years, the Scharnhorst and her sister ships had been a thorn in the side of the Royal Navy, a fleet in being that paralyzed Allied naval strategy. Their mere existence in the northern fjords forced the British to deploy heavy assets to protect the vital Arctic convoys, the lifeline of supplies to the Soviet Union. Every convoy that sailed from the locks of Scotland to the frozen ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk did so under the shadow of this predator. The threat was so significant that the British Home Fleet, the direct descendant of the navy that had defeated the Spanish Armada and vanquished Napoleon, now spent its days as a bodyguard for merchant ships, a duty dictated by the menace of a single German warship. By Christmas of 1943, the strategic situation had become desperate for Germany. The tide had turned at Stalingrad and in North Africa. The U-boat offensive was failing in the Atlantic. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, now Supreme Commander of the Kriegsmarine, was under immense pressure from a Führer who viewed his expensive and inactive capital ships with growing contempt. Dönitz needed a victory, a spectacular success to prove the continued relevance of the German surface fleet. Intelligence reports provided an opportunity. 2 Allied convoys were at sea, the westbound RA-55A, returning empty from Russia, and the eastbound JW-55B, a 19-ship convoy loaded with tanks, aircraft, and raw materials, heading for Murmansk. Air reconnaissance reported that the convoy's heavy escort, the battleship HMS Duke of York, had been sighted far to the west. This was a critical error in German intelligence, a fatal miscalculation that would doom the Scharnhorst. Believing the convoy was protected only by cruisers and destroyers, Dönitz saw his chance. He issued the order for Operation Ostfront. The Scharnhorst would sortie, annihilate the convoy, and return to its lair before the British capital ships could intervene. The command of the operation fell to Rear Admiral Eric Bay. Bay was a destroyer man, a brave and experienced officer, but he was not a capital ship commander. He was uneasy about the mission, aware of the immense risks of operating in the polar night, where storms could scatter his destroyer screen, and where the enemy now possessed a decisive, almost magical advantage: radar. The British, however, were not unprepared. The man commanding the home fleet, Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, was a meticulous, cold-blooded planner. He was a gunnery and technology specialist who understood that modern naval warfare was won not by daring, but by the careful application of overwhelming, technologically superior force. Having anticipated a German attack on the convoys, he had laid a trap of exquisite precision. Fraser's plan was a masterpiece of naval deception and coordination, dividing his forces into 2 powerful groups. The first, designated Force 1, was under the command of Vice Admiral Robert Burnett. This was the bait. It consisted of the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk and the light cruisers HMS Belfast and HMS Sheffield. These ships would provide close cover for the convoy, their task being to find the Scharnhorst, shadow it, and if possible, slow it down. The key to Burnett's force was HMS Belfast. The cruiser was equipped with the new Type 273 centimetric surface search radar, a piece of technology so advanced it could detect a battleship-sized target at over 30,000 yards, far beyond the range of human sight in the Arctic twilight. It could see in the dark, through snow squalls, and over the horizon. The second group, Force 2, was the Hammer. Commanded by Fraser himself from the bridge of his flagship, the new battleship HMS Duke of York. This force was the real threat. The Duke of York was one of Britain's most powerful warships, armed with 10 14-inch guns. Its shells, each weighing over 1,500 pounds, could penetrate Scharnhorst's armor from 20,000 yards. Critically, the Duke of York possessed the Type 284 gunnery control radar, a system that could track the fall of its own shells and allow for astonishingly accurate fire against an unseen target. Sailing with the flagship were the light cruiser HMS Jamaica and a screen of 4 S-class destroyers. Fraser's plan was simple. Admiral Burnett's cruisers would find the Scharnhorst with their superior search radar, draw it south away from the convoy, and lead the German Predator directly into the waiting guns of the Duke of York. The German battleship was sailing into an electronic web, a perfectly orchestrated ambush where the enemy knew its every move, while it itself was functionally blind. The technological disparity was immense. The Scharnhorst was equipped with the German Sea-Tact radar, an early and effective system, but one that was vulnerable and less precise than the new British centimetric sets. The Germans were about to learn the brutal lesson that in a radar-driven battle, the side with the better system dictates the terms of the engagement. At 19 sucks on Christmas Day, Scharnhorst, accompanied by 5 Narvik-class destroyers, slipped its moorings at Altafjord and steamed north into a rising gale. The weather was atrocious, with force 8 winds whipping the sea into a frenzy of mountainous waves and blinding snow. On the Scharnhorst's bridge, Admiral Bay was already facing a crisis. The storm was so violent that his smaller destroyers were struggling to keep up. Their effectiveness as a protective screen was being nullified by the elements. The German plan relied on these destroyers to fan out and locate the convoy, but in these seas, they were becoming a liability. Unseen by the Germans, 400 miles to the west, Admiral Fraser on the Duke of York received the signal he had been waiting for. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had been reading German naval enigma traffic, intercepted the orders for Operation Ostfront. Fraser now knew the Scharnhorst was at sea. The trap was set, and the prey was on the move. He ordered the convoy to reverse course and steam north, drawing it away from the danger zone, while he himself altered his course to the northeast, calculating the perfect interception point. He was not merely reacting, he was controlling the entire battle space, using signals intelligence and radar data to choreograph the engagement before a single shot had been fired. By the morning of December the 26th, the Battle of the North Cape had begun, though only one side knew it. At 0840, the radar screen in HMS Belfast operations room glowed with a new contact. A single, large target, bearing 225 degrees, ranged 35,000 yards. It was the Scharnhorst. Vice Admiral Burnett, his ships hidden in a snow squall, had found his quarry without the Germans even knowing they had been detected. For nearly an hour, Burnett shadowed the German battleship, plotting its course and speed, feeding the information back to Admiral Fraser, who was now steaming at full speed to close the distance. On the Scharnhorst's bridge, there was an uneasy quiet. Admiral Bay, having lost contact with his destroyers in the storm, had decided to press on alone, a fatal decision that left him without a screen. He was hunting the convoy, completely unaware that he himself was being hunted. At 09:24, the moment of truth arrived. Burnett gave the order to open fire. The 8-inch guns of HMS Norfolk and the 6-inch guns of HMS Belfast erupted in the pre-dawn gloom. The first salvos were fired entirely by radar direction. The Scharnhorst's crew were thrown into stunned confusion as shells began landing around them, seemingly from out of nowhere. Bright orange flashes illuminated the churning sea as the British star shells burst overhead, stripping away the cover of darkness. The reaction on the German battleship was swift and professional. Her own 11-inch guns roared in response, their massive shells creating towering waterspouts around the British cruisers. But in the opening moments of the exchange, a single British shell performed a mission of almost unbelievable importance. An 8-inch shell from Norfolk smashed into Scharnhorst's foretop, wrecking the ship's primary Z-Tact radar aerial. In an instant, the Scharnhorst's electronic eyes were put out. While she could still fire her guns using optical directors, her ability to detect and engage targets in the poor visibility and darkness was now crippled. Admiral Bay was blind. Realizing he was engaged with cruisers, a force he could easily outgun, Bay made a logical decision. He turned south, hoping to circle around the escort and approach the convoy from a new direction. This was exactly what Admiral Fraser had hoped he would do. Every knot the Scharnhorst steamed south was a knot closer to the waiting 14-inch guns of the Duke of York. The first phase of the battle was over. The British cruisers had done their job perfectly. They had found the enemy, damaged its fighting capability, and, most importantly, had maneuvered it directly into the heart of the main trap. Throughout the day, a deadly cat-and-mouse game unfolded in the Arctic twilight. Admiral Burnett's cruisers tenaciously shadowed the Scharnhorst, darting in and out of snow squalls, firing salvos whenever they gained a clear radar picture, then retreating before the German battleship could bring its heavy guns to bear effectively. They were like wolves harassing a great bear, snapping at its flanks, bleeding its strength, and driving it towards the lead hunter. HMS Norfolk took 2 11-inch shell hits that killed an officer and 6 men and disabled a gun turret, but she remained in the fight. On the Scharnhorst, Admiral Bay was becoming increasingly frustrated. Twice he tried to shake off the cruisers and steer north towards the convoy's last known position. And twice Burnett's force reappeared on his quarter, guided by Belfast's unwavering radar. The German admiral was trapped in a paradox. He was on one of the most powerful warships afloat, yet he was being controlled and herded by a force of lighter, weaker cruisers that he could not shake. His formidable speed and firepower were rendered useless by an enemy who could always see him, while he could only fight back at what he could glimpse through the swirling snow. The psychological strain on the German crew was immense. They were fighting an invisible enemy, a phantom fleet that struck from the storm and vanished again, its presence marked only by the shell splashes that erupted from the grey sea. By late afternoon, Admiral Fraser knew the moment was near. Aboard the Duke of York, the atmosphere was one of quiet, professional tension. The flagship's own radar had picked up Burnett's cruisers, and beyond them, the larger contact of the Scharnhorst. The range was closing steadily. Fraser had maintained complete radio silence throughout the day, ensuring the Germans had no idea a British battleship was anywhere in the vicinity. The Scharnhorst, steaming south after its final failed attempt to reach the convoy, was sailing into the jaws of the trap. At 16:17, the Duke of York's radar operator reported the Scharnhorst was at a range of 45,500 yards, just over 22 nautical miles. The German battleship was completely unaware of its impending doom. On the British flagship's bridge, Admiral Fraser allowed himself a rare moment of emotion, turning to his officers and remarking on the perfection of the setup. He had his enemy exactly where he wanted him, silhouetted against the lighter southern horizon, while his own ships were masked by the northern darkness. At 16:47, the moment for which the entire operation had been planned arrived. The Duke of York's gunnery officer reported that the Scharnhorst was in range of the main battery. The British battleship's 10 14-inch guns, guided by the precise calculations of the Type 284 radar, trained on a target they could not see. The first star shells were fired, bursting high above the Scharnhorst and bathing the German warship in an eerie, brilliant magnesium light. For the men on the Scharnhorst's bridge, it was a moment of pure, undiluted horror. They were no longer being harassed by cruisers. Dead ahead of them, flashing in the night, were the massive, unmistakable gun flashes of a heavy battleship. The trap had sprung. The first salvo from HMS Duke of York was not a ranging shot. It was a statement of industrial and technological annihilation. 10 14-inch guns, guided by the cold mathematics of the Type 284 radar, unleashed a barrage that screamed through the Arctic night. Each shell weighed 1,590 pounds, the weight of a small car, and travelled at over 2,400 feet per second. The radar system allowed the British gunnery officer to see the splash of the shells in relation to the target, making corrections with a speed and accuracy that was impossible with optical rangefinders alone. On Scharnhorst's bridge, the surprise was absolute. The ship's lookouts and officers were blinded by the star shells, their night vision destroyed. Before they could even recover, the sea around them erupted in a series of colossal waterspouts as the first salvo landed, perfectly bracketing the ship. They were being engaged by an enemy they could not see. from a range they thought was safe, with an accuracy that defied belief. Rear Admiral Bay reacted with the skill of a seasoned commander. He ordered an immediate turn to starboard, bringing his ship's full broadside to bear while simultaneously trying to open the range. The German gunnery crews, among the best in the world, needed no radar to return fire. They aimed at the massive, blinding flashes of the enemy's guns on the horizon. Within minutes, Scharnhorst's 9 11-inch guns answered with a salvo of their own. Her shells, though smaller at 728 pounds, were fired with superb precision. And the men on the Duke of York's bridge watched in grim appreciation as massive columns of water rose just yards from their own ship. For a moment, it was a classic battleship duel, a contest of titans. But it was a duel where one fighter was blindfolded. The second salvo from the Duke of York was a direct hit. A 14-inch shell smashed into Scharnhorst's forward superfiring turret, Bruno jamming it in its training gear and putting it permanently out of action. Another shell from the same salvo hit near the forward seaplane hangar, starting fires. The German battleship had lost 1/3 of its primary firepower in the opening minutes. Despite this damage, the Scharnhorst was a remarkably resilient ship, a product of superb German engineering. Her armor belt, over 13 inches thick, was designed to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. For the next hour, she absorbed a relentless pounding while continuing to fire back with deadly accuracy. Her speed was still her greatest asset. Even with fires raging, she was able to pull away from the Duke of York, the range opening yard by yard. On Fraser's flagship, a sense of anxiety began to grow. The Scharnhorst was proving incredibly tough, and if it could maintain its speed advantage, it might just escape into the darkness. Admiral Fraser knew that the entire battle hinged on one thing: slowing the enemy down. He pushed his engines to their absolute limit, the Duke of York shuddering as she forced her way through the heavy seas, desperately trying to keep the Scharnhorst within range of her guns. The chase was on. For 30 miles, the two behemoths raced through the Arctic storm, exchanging salvos in a running battle. The British cruisers, Belfast and Jamaica, added their own fire, their 6-inch guns peppering the German ship's superstructure, tearing apart secondary gun positions and starting new fires. Then, at 18:20, came the single most important shell hit of the entire battle. A 14-inch shell from the Duke of York, fired from a range of over 10 miles, plunged down at a steep angle. It pierced the Scharnhorst's thin upper deck armor and continued its journey deep into the bowels of the ship before its delayed action fuse detonated. The shell exploded in number 1 boiler room. The effect was catastrophic. The blast ruptured a main steam pipe, instantly filling the space with superheated steam that killed every man inside. With one of its 3 boiler rooms destroyed, the Scharnhorst's speed dropped precipitously. The flow of steam to the turbines was slashed, and the revolutions on her propellers began to fall. Her top speed fell from over 30 knots to just 22, and it was still dropping. The race was over. The Scharnhorst could no longer run. Her greatest advantage had been stripped away by a single, perfectly placed projectile guided by an invisible radar beam. On the bridge of the Duke of York, the mood shifted from anxiety to grim certainty. They had her. The German battleship was now trapped, a wounded beast that could be brought down at leisure. With the Scharnhorst crippled, Admiral Fraser saw his moment to send in the wolves. At 1850, he gave the order for his 4 destroyers, HMS Savage, Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian destroyer HMS Duke, to close in and finish the job with torpedoes. This was the death ride, a maneuver that demanded almost suicidal bravery. These small, thin-skinned ships had to charge directly at a wounded but still furiously fighting battleship. The Scharnhorst's secondary armament of 5.9-inch guns, designed specifically to repel destroyer attacks, was still largely operational. As the destroyers split into 2 divisions to attack from both sides, they were met with a storm of fire. The night was lit up by tracer shells and the flashes of German guns. The sea around the small ships boiled with shell splashes. HMS Saumarez was hit multiple times, the shells tearing through her unarmored hull. killing 11 men and wounding 11 more. Her radar and rangefinders were smashed, but she pressed on. Braving the inferno, the 4 destroyers got to within 3,000 yards, a virtual knife fight in naval terms, and launched their torpedoes. A total of 28 tin fish were sent streaking towards the crippled German giant. The Scharnhorst's crew saw the whitewakes approaching and tried desperately to evade, but the ship was too slow, too sluggish. 4 torpedoes found their mark. 4 massive explosions ripped through the Scharnhorst's hull, each one carrying a warhead of over 800 pounds of torpex. The blast tore open her armor belt, caused massive flooding, and further reduced her speed to a mere crawl. She was now listing heavily, her mighty guns struggling to train on the darting destroyers that had just sealed her fate. The destroyer attack had been a stunning success, but it had come at a cost. The battered Saumarez was forced to withdraw, her place in the line taken by the cruisers. The Scharnhorst was now a floating wreck, but her battle flag was still flying. Her remaining guns still fired defiantly at any target they could acquire. She would not surrender. Admiral Fraser decided it was time to end it. He brought the Duke of York and HMS Jamaica in for the final brutal phase of the battle, the methodical, industrial destruction of the enemy. The range closed to 10,000 yards, point-blank range for these massive naval guns. What followed was no longer a duel. It was an execution. The British ships began to systematically pour fire into the dying Scharnhorst. It was a deluge of steel, a continuous overwhelming storm of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. The 14-inch guns of the Duke of York fired salvo after salvo, their shells smashing through the German battleship's thickest armor. The 6-inch guns of Belfast and Jamaica fired with the speed of machine guns, their smaller shells sweeping the superstructure, demolishing everything above the main deck. The Scharnhorst was engulfed in fire and explosions. Her upper works were transformed into a twisted, incandescent junkyard of shredded steel. Her guns were silenced one by one as direct hits destroyed the turrets or killed their crews. Yet even in her death throes, she was magnificent. One of her aft turrets, Caesar, continued to fire sporadically until it was finally knocked out. The process of destruction was relentless and terrible. The British fleet circled their prey, firing continuously. There was no escape and no hope for the 1,700 men trapped inside the burning, flooding steel coffin. The ship was taking on a massive amount of water from the torpedo hits, and her list was increasing dramatically. Smoke and steam poured from 100 different gashes in her hull and deck. The glow from the internal fires was so intense that it was visible for miles. A funeral pyre in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. To hasten the end, Fraser ordered a final torpedo attack. The cruisers Belfast and Jamaica, along with the remaining destroyers, closed in and launched a final volley. At least 6 more torpedoes slammed into the Scharnhorst's ravaged hull. These were the final blows. The internal destruction was now absolute. The ship's watertight integrity was gone. At 19:45, after nearly 2 hours of continuous brutal punishment from the main British force, the end came. The Scharnhorst, now burning from stem to stern, her deck almost vertical, began to sink by the stern. A series of deep internal explosions rumbled from within her hull, likely her boilers or magazines finally giving way. With a great hiss of steam, she slid backwards beneath the waves, her bow rising high into the air before vanishing into the churning, freezing sea. The Battle of the North Cape was over. The ghost of the fjords had been exorcised. Of the 1,068 men aboard the Scharnhorst, including Rear Admiral Bay and the ship's captain, only 36 were pulled alive from the icy water by the British destroyers. The search for survivors was brief. In those temperatures, life expectancy in the water was measured in minutes. Aboard the Duke of York, as reports confirmed the sinking, a quiet solemnity descended on the bridge. Admiral Fraser, in a gesture of respect for a valiant enemy, turned to his officers and said, "Gentlemen, the battle against Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior, you will command your ship as gallantly as Scharnhorst was commanded today. The trap, conceived in strategic planning rooms and executed with the invisible beams of radar, had closed with devastating and final effect. As the last traces of the Scharnhorst vanished from the surface, a profound quiet fell over the battle area, broken only by the howling of the wind and the commands of British officers directing the search for survivors. The HMS Scorpion and Matchless lingered on the scene, their searchlights cutting futile beams through the darkness and snow, finding only oil slicks, debris, and a handful of men clinging to life in the deathly cold. The rest of the British fleet, battered but triumphant, turned for home. The cost to the Royal Navy had been miraculously light. 13 men killed and 1 cruiser and 1 destroyer damaged. For the Germans, the loss was total and catastrophic. On the bridge of the Duke of York, Admiral Fraser composed a simple, factual signal to the Admiralty in London. It contained none of the soaring language of past naval heroes, but was instead a cold statement of industrial fact, a CEO reporting on a successful corporate action. It read, "Scharnhorst sunk." He then addressed the men of his flagship, his words reflecting a professional pride not in the glory of battle but in the perfection of their gunnery, a task executed with the precision of a machine. The victory was not seen as a triumph of bravery, but as the successful application of a superior system of destruction. This was the fundamental truth of the Battle of the North Cape. It was a victory won not just in the Arctic maelstrom, but years earlier in the laboratories of Birmingham University and the factories of industrial Britain. The Scharnhorst, for all its power, was an analog weapon in a digital war. The decisive factor was the cavity magnetron, the device at the heart of Britain's new centimetric radar systems. German radar, like the SATAC set, operated on a metric wavelength which gave it a broad, imprecise beam. It could tell you something was there, but its ability to resolve fine details was poor. British centimetric radar, operating on a much shorter wavelength, painted a picture of astonishing clarity. The Type 273 surface search set on HMS Belfast could distinguish the individual ships in a convoy and could hold a contact even in the worst sea clutter. The Type 284 gunnery set on the Duke of York was a revolution. It could not only track the enemy ship but also detect the splash of its own 14-inch shells, allowing the gunnery officer to walk his salvos onto the target with lethal precision without ever laying eyes on it. The Germans were fighting with a blurry photograph. The British were fighting with a live, high-definition video feed. The Scharnhorst's crew were some of the finest in the Kriegsmarine, and their gunnery, when they could see a target, was excellent. But they were helpless against an enemy that could land a 1-ton shell on their deck from 10 miles away in a snowstorm. The battle was the ultimate vindication of British naval investment in electronic warfare. Every salvo from the Duke of York was a testament to this new reality. The flashes on the radar screen in the darkened operations room were more decisive than the flashes of the guns themselves. The trap laid by Admiral Fraser was not merely a ring of ships. It was an invisible, inescapable net of electromagnetic energy. Once the Scharnhorst's own radar was knocked out, it was doomed. It spent the rest of its short life being tracked, herded, and ultimately destroyed by forces it could not detect. A blind giant flailing in the dark. Back in Germany, the news of the sinking was a devastating blow to the Kriegsmarine and to the Führer himself. The loss of the Scharnhorst marked the effective end of Germany's surface fleet as an offensive weapon. Never again would a German capital ship challenge Allied control of the sea lanes. The immense investment in these powerful ships had yielded almost nothing but a series of costly and humiliating defeats. The Graf Spee was scuttled, the Bismarck was sunk, and now the Scharnhorst lay at the bottom of the Arctic. The German naval strategy, which relied on daring raids by individual superior ships against the plodding Allied convoy system, had been rendered obsolete. It was a strategy from a previous era, defeated by a system of overwhelming numbers, superior intelligence, and technological dominance. The Royal Navy, supported by the industrial might of the United States, could afford to build dozens of escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Germany could only produce a handful of exquisite, powerful, and ultimately useless battleships. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. With the Scharnhorst gone, the threat to the Arctic convoys was drastically reduced. The British were now able to release heavy units like the Duke of York for duty elsewhere, particularly in preparation for the upcoming invasion of Normandy. The flow of war material to the Soviet Union continued unabated, fueling the Red Army's relentless advance on the Eastern Front. The sinking was a small battle in the grand scheme of the war, but its strategic ripple effect was enormous. It was a nail in the coffin of the Third Reich, hammered home in the freezing darkness of the North Cape. For the 1932 men who perished with the Scharnhorst, their fate was sealed by decisions made far away. By engineers and scientists they would never know. They served with skill and courage on a magnificent warship. But they were sent into a battle that was unwinnable before they ever left the fjord. They were victims not of British shells and torpedoes, but of a fatal disparity in technology and information. The final legacy of the Battle of the North Cape is a stark lesson in the nature of modern industrial warfare. The German battleship Scharnhorst was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a powerful symbol of national pride. It was fast, well-armored, and manned by a superb crew. By every traditional measure of naval power, it was a formidable opponent. And yet, it was utterly obsolete. It was defeated and destroyed by a fleet that had embraced the future. A future where battles were won by processing data faster than the enemy, where victory was achieved through superior sensors and processors, where the ability to see in the dark was more important than the thickness of armor. The Scharnhorst sailed into the Arctic night to hunt a convoy, believing itself to be the predator. It never understood that it was the prey, lured into a perfectly laid electronic ambush. The Royal Navy had not just sunk a battleship. It had proven that the age of the naval gunfighter was over, and the age of electronic warfare had begun. The trap was not just a naval maneuver, it was a glimpse into the future of combat itself.